Hello, everyone. Welcome to this event. We're joined today by Dr. Emeka Njoku and Saskia Brechenmacher for this latest event at the European Centre for Populism Studies. Dr. Njoku is currently a Newton International Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Society, and was selected as a postdoctoral fellow for the American Council of Learned Societies. His research focuses on the intersection of civil society organizations and security governance, particularly post 9/11 international and state level counterterrorism policies and practices. And we're really privileged to be joined by him today. Saskia Brechenmacher is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge and a fellow in Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict and Governance program, where her research focuses on gender, civil society and democratic governance. Her writing has been published in The National Interest, The Hill, New America Weekly, Open Democracy, and other publications, and she previously worked at the World Peace Foundation and co-led a research project on corruption and state legitimacy in Uganda. I apologize for the slightly truncated version of both our speakers' biographies. You can find more comprehensive versions of both on the ECPS website, along with details about all of our upcoming events. But suffice to say, we're joined today by two extraordinarily accomplished scholars, and for that, we're extremely lucky. So today's talk builds on Dr. Njoku's article, The State and Securitization of Civil Society Organizations in Nigeria, which featured in a recent edition of Non-Profit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly. And the talk is entitled, The Closing of Civic Spaces in the Time of Terrorism in Nigeria. So you've heard quite enough from me, and without further ado.
I want to thank the European Center for Populism Study for giving me the opportunity to present a part of the findings of my PhD thesis, which, like was stated earlier, the state and the securitization of civil society organizations in Nigeria, published in Non-Profit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly. I want to thank Zara for making this possible, and Saskia for agreeing to be the discussant of this paper. I titled it The Closing of Civic Spaces in the Time of Terrorism in Nigeria. Now, there have been, after 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US, there were narratives that civil society organizations have served as conduits for the proliferation of terrorism, for the spread of terrorism in different parts of the world. And there was a need for civil society organizations to be regulated or controlled as part of efforts to curb the rise of terrorism. And so the Financial Action Task Force and also the United Nations and various other international financial organizations came together and to form various counterterrorism finance and legal instruments, one of which was formed by the Financial Action Task Force was the Recommendation 8. It was a legal instrument that directs states and private organizations to domesticate and enforce laws that prevent terrorist groups' use of CSOs to transfer funds through bank channels. State actors established and enforced these laws were domesticated in various states in different parts of the world. And with that, CSOs or civil society organizations were effectively securitized because the state aids, various foreign aids to civil society organizations have become an issue of security concern. And so that foreign aids have become regulated by state actors as part of efforts in curbing terrorism. According to Jude Howell and various other actors stated that the curbing of the operations of civil society organizations, it stems from an increasing interest on the operations of civil society organizations. And what the post 9/11 counterterrorism policy did was to provide a platform in which state actors can legitimately establish laws that regulates the operation of civil society. She said that I consider it a historical moment, a point of convergence, and a junction where this growing thread of disquiet, pre-existing frictions between the 6 CSOs and the state, came together, and the state was able to, establish laws that, check on the operations of civil society organizations. And so we've seen in different parts of the world how these laws have manifested. For instance, only recently in 2019, organizations such as the ANERA, Near East Foundation, Catholic Relief Services, closed operations in West Bank and Gaza. They had to close operations because of the recent 2018 Anti-Terrorism Financing Clarification Act by the United States, that state actors in various parts of the world are liable to be prosecuted in US courts if funds, foreign aids to CSOs find their hands used by terrorist organizations, or terrorist organizations are able to manipulate CSOs to fund their organizations. So government of these countries that these particular things happen are liable to be prosecuted in US court. And the Palestinian government had to stop various organizations from operating because they said they cannot be liable to what organizations do within their territories. They don't have such control, and so they cannot be liable. We have seen this in also in Egypt, where counterterrorism policies were established to target human rights organizations. The accounts were frozen, and what this government did, was to use the monies from these organizations to fund state-opted organizations, those organizations or CSOs that are working for the state. So we have seen also in Bahrain, where the government stripped citizens' rights from Saeed Ahmed Al-Wadi, the director of Institute for Rights and Democracy, as part of counterterrorism policies or laws, which frowns at any form of political advocacy. Now, they have been in different parts of the world. We have seen an increasing closing of the operational spaces of civil society organizations on the pretext of countering counterterrorism, or for curbing terrorism, or as part of counterterrorism policies. Recently in Nigeria, a group of young protesters, youths, carried out a huge protest across the country. It was tagged the End SARS, hashtag the End SARS. It means end the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which is because of their brutality in terms of how they enforce or carry out their operations. And there have been all kinds of human rights violations by this special unit of the Nigerian police. And so this led to this protest. But in response, the Nigerian government used the counterterrorism laws to freeze the accounts of 20 of these protesters on the grounds that on the grounds that they have committed acts of terrorism by getting funds from various groups. So for months, these young Nigerian youths, 20 of them, accounts were frozen and their life practically stopped. So these represent the actions of these governments in various parts of the world, highlight attempts by states to establish and enforce sweeping anti-terrorism laws as part of global counterterrorism policies. So the perception that CSOs are at risk of infiltration and exploitation by terrorist groups inform the embrace and deployment of counterterrorism policies that regulated their access to foreign aid in different political contexts. So, however, the enforcement of these laws have, led to the securitization of foreign aid, which has negatively affected the operationality of CSOs and closed civic spaces, and is now transforming voluntary and associational life. Now, we all know in Nigeria, there have been, of course, the rise of terrorist groups like Boko Haram and Islamic State of West African province. And so the Nigerian government has joined, the various parts of the world to establish the Terrorism Prevention Act of 2011 as amended, and the Money Laundering Prohibition Act was amended several times until 2011 and of course in 2013. Now, certain sections of these laws were in response to the Financial Action Task Force directive of states and private financial organizations to regulate the operations of civil society organizations. For instance, in Section 13, subsection 1, 2, and 3 of the Terrorism Prevention Act, and Section 5, 6, 10, 13 of the Money Laundering Prohibition Act authorize the Nigerian government through the financial institutions to establish surveillance mechanism in vetting and reporting transactions of non-financial organizations to the Economic and Financial Crime Commission, and also recently the National Financial Agency that has recently been established. Now, what I tried to do in my research is to examine the ongoing debates in different parts of the world. Or particularly how these laws, the enforcement of counterterrorism policies have securitized foreign aids for civil society organizations. So I'm interested in understanding how counterterrorism policies have securitized foreign aids for civil society organizations. I'm also interested in understanding which types of CSOs are more likely to report financial constraints and why. I also examine what are the attendant adverse effects of counterterrorism financing measures on CSOs operationality, and how have CSOs responded. I did this, I examined these questions through a systematic study, because within the literature there have been calls for systematic studies that help to balance theoretical level analysis on the impact of counterterrorism policies on civil society organizations. So I addressed these preceding questions, trying to examine the perceptions of CSO staff and their executives on the effect of counterterrorism policies on their counterterrorism financing on their operations in Nigeria, the countermeasures that these CSOs are taking, and the perspective of the government. That's why the government is establishing these laws, why they think that CSOs pose as security threats. So the question then is, why is Nigeria, using Nigeria as a case study, why is Nigeria important? Now, in Nigeria, we have had a very tense state civil society organizations, particularly during the military rule. CSOs were very active in terms of political advocacy, advocating for the interests of the marginalized group in Nigeria. So during military rule, they were very active. However, after 1999, there were arguments that the activism that once defined civil society organizations have declined over the years. So I'm interested in understanding that how counterterrorism policies that are invocative of the military rule in Nigeria, how CSOs would respond to these counterterrorism policies that are, invocative of various military rule. So in the civilian organization, and so that's why Nigeria is an important case study for us to understand the dynamics of counterterrorism policies in the country. So I did this through a mixed methods, both quantitative and qualitative data. I identified 445 program officers of CSOs in 26 organizations, of which 205 of these program officers were eventually surveyed and used for analysis. I also, interviewed 10 executives of civil society organizations and 6 government officials, and the locations for these studies were Abuja, Lagos, and also 3 northeastern states in Nigeria. I also used secondary sources from reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and also, of course, the various government gazettes on counterterrorism laws in Nigeria. Now, let me go straight to the findings. But I must state that although we saw in various parts of, particularly in aid recipient countries in Africa, from the research or the debates, there have been an increase in terms of how CSOs were repressed in the implementation of counterterrorism policies. But in Nigeria, we discovered that for counterterrorism financing policies were not as constraining as we have seen in this political context. So I identified various variables. For instance, increase in administrative costs, financial constraints, loss of resources, and restriction of access to foreign aids, demand for more information, delay international transfer, denial of access to transferred funds, and denial of closure of accounts. So these are the variables that I examined in the analysis. And for increase in administrative costs, about 49.3% of CSOs agreed that counterterrorism laws increase cost of operations. Human rights organizations were significantly more likely to state that counterterrorism policies affect their administrative costs compared to other categories of faith organizations, such as faith-based organizations and youth and children. And 13.2% of CSOs affirmed that counterterrorism policies led to increase in financial constraints. Now, regarding loss of resources, only 24.4% of CSOs agreed that counterterrorism financing policies led to the loss of resources, whereas women CSOs and big organizations were significantly more likely to assert that counterterrorism financing policies led to loss of economic resources. In terms of restriction of access to foreign aid, 74% of CSOs reported that they did not experience any of these restrictions. majority of the of CSOs said that they have not experienced banks demanding much information from them. These are ways in which CSOs are so this surveillance mechanism work, but majority of them reported that they didn't experience some of these practices. Only 23.3% of respondents agreed that CTMs have led to delay international transfer, and 15.1% of respondents agreed that they had experienced denial of transferred funds, while 84% disagreed. Now, women organizations agreed that stated that they are more likely to experience, denial of access to transferred funds. Also, human rights organizations also reported they experience more in terms of denial of access to transferred funds. Now, 15.6% of all participants agreed that CTM led to denial of access to accounts, while 14.2% of participants agreed that it led to closure of accounts. Now, why these findings are not so significant, but it does show from the interviews that I conducted that some organizations are experiencing some form of control and regulations by the government. Particularly, is a particular human rights organization that I interviewed, where he said that the government is not just regulating them, although it's not so much, but they were, various organizations complain that they have seen various forms of delay in accessing funds, and some of these organizations complain that even their personal funds have also been affected. A particular CSO program officer stated that he got he did a job for an organization abroad, and they transferred money to his account, about $5,000 or so, but he was unable to access this money because the government or the banks flagged it as suspicious. And so this money was sent back to the organization that sent it. So even though these laws were not as constraining, they were, there have been certain reports that these laws are, gradually impinging on the operations or the finances of civil society organizations. And part of the findings is to examine government responses. Why have government, what are their objectives, or what are their reasons for establishing counterterrorism policies? And government accused CSOs of not being objective on issue of regulation, that there have been reported cases of CSOs that are culpable in terrorism. Particularly, they mentioned a Muslim trust and charity foundation that the government believe have been involved in terrorism. And government also accused CSOs of destabilizing the polity through various advocacy projects, advocating for the interests of the marginalized and vulnerable individuals, or those people that are suspected to be involved in terrorism. The government believes that the activities of these organizations are obstructing government's counterterrorism objective of trying to tackle or address terrorism. So these were the responses of government, that some civil society organizations are pro-terrorist group and of frustrating the various counterterrorism objectives of the government. Now, I also examined how CSOs have responded to these various policies and practices that are, impinge on their operationality. And one of the things that most of the organizations said, about 23.9% of them agreed that they believe that the government see that they provide moral support to terrorist organizations. Women organizations and faith-based organizations were significantly more likely to agree that the government believe that they are providing moral support to terrorist groups. And 23% of CSOs also agree that the government believe that they are providing financial support to terrorist groups. And women group and faith-based organizations were also significantly more likely to state that the government believe that they provide financial support to terrorist groups. 29.8% of respondents at CSOs agreed that the state believe that CSOs are more like an ideological route for terrorism. Big organizations, women organizations, and faith-based organizations were significantly more likely to have this view that the government see them as an ideological route for terrorist organizations. And one question that I believe people would want to understand is why women, why faith-based organizations? It's not really a surprise, because women and faith-based organizations have been discussions in the literature on the roles that women organizations and faith-based organizations are playing in the Northeast in terms of advocating for women and girls who have been whose rights have been violated in the Northeast. And these reports of human rights violation, government is not really comfortable with it because it projects the government in a bad light, and the government is quick to repress such activism by these organizations because it makes it difficult for them to access foreign aid from various governments. And so, yeah, that's one of the findings of the research. And so then another important part of the research is to understand what efforts have CSOs made in terms of getting government, in terms of responding in various ways, criticizing government in terms of the repressive nature of the counterterrorism financing measures that have been established. And so we asked CSOs what efforts have they made to influence the government into changing or amending these laws, because they are, of course, causing increasing administrative costs and making it difficult for them to operate. However, a vast majority, up to 90.77%, have not lobbied the government. They have not testified before legislative committees over CTMs or complaints over CTMs. 89% affirm that they have not taken government to court. However, women and faith-based organizations are also big organizations were more likely to have taken the government to court compared to other forms of organizations, such as human rights and smaller organizations. So we see that majority of the organizations have not done much in terms of pushing back or trying to get governments to amend this repressive nature of counterterrorism policies. This result contradicts what has happened or how CSOs have responded in countries such as in Kenya, in Uganda, even in Egypt, where some CSOs have pushed back, have taken government to court. Even in the US and in the UK, you've seen most CSOs have challenged certain provisions of the counterterrorism financing laws or counterterrorism laws more broadly. But in Nigeria, we have not seen this level of resistance towards counterterrorism policies in Nigeria. Now, what do all these findings mean? I highlight three main issues. One, even though counterterrorism financing laws were not as constraining as we would have expected, particularly what we have seen in the current conversations on the impact of counterterrorism policies, counterterrorism laws appears to have increased the administrative costs of CSOs and significantly impacted or disadvantaged smaller organizations or less prominent organizations. So most of these smaller organizations have had to stop operations or merge with bigger organizations for them to continue to operate. That's one of the things that we take out from the findings. Also, human rights organizations reported higher organizational costs and faced difficulties in implementing their programs due to government antagonism towards their political activism. Women groups also face financial constraints or financial problems, part due to the advocacy efforts for vulnerable women and girls whose rights have been violated by security agents in counterterrorism operations in northeastern Nigeria. Now, three, the result also shows state increasing interest in the financing of civil societies on the grounds of national security imperatives. And the CTM laws are, of course, they are evolving and they are incrementally placing restraints on CSOs. And I'm arguing that this, even though we have not seen the level of restraint as we have observed in other African countries, these laws are evolving. And as we have seen with the NSAS protesters, where government is using counterterrorism laws to repress or freeze the accounts of these protesters, or with journalists, where government use counterterrorism laws to charge most journalists that they are involved in terrorism acts, because they use that to ensure that they don't get the reprieve from courts, because when you mention terrorism, it's an exceptional law. And so when you mention terrorism, every other human rights considerations are pushed aside. And the government have a form of legitimacy in terms of weird legitimacy in terms of repressing credible oppositions or human rights activists in the country. So there are various indicators that show that these laws are expanding. Particularly, the Terrorism Prevention Act of 2011 was amended in 2013, and the areas that the government focused on was the financing of or the financial operations of CSOs. And so the government also, established the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit, which is also in charge have been charged to regulate the activities of CSOs. I remember one of the pioneering director of the organization saying that they are going to target a lot of, they have identified 100 CSOs, and they are going to target them because they believe that these CSOs are providing funds for terrorist organizations. Most of CSOs have told the government, provide evidence of these CSOs that you believe are supporting terrorists. And so far, there have not been any CSOs that have been charged, have been taken to court on these allegations of providing financial support to terrorist organizations. Moreover, we have seen various indications such as government using the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit or Financial Intelligence Unit to monitor and CSOs to require, they are all directed to re-register their organizations. This is even though these organizations have registered with the Corporate Affairs Commission in Nigeria, but they are asked to be registered all over again. And there have been directives that CSOs should undergo various audits and to report their financial activities. Importantly, there is a bill currently in the National Assembly which will start the NGO bill, the NGO regulatory bill. What the bill does is very explicit in terms of how the aim of the bill is to regulate the financing of CSOs, particularly foreign aid. Foreign aid that comes to CSOs will be, if the bill becomes law, will be checked by the government, and government would have the power to decide which organizations would have access to these foreign funds and which organizations would not have access to it. So these are part of the analysis of what the findings mean. Now, in conclusion, I'm saying that we may infer that counterterrorism policies are gaining ground in Nigeria, and CSOs might experience increased regulations on access to foreign donor funds and a possible increase in the operational costs. And this may lead to an increase in the co-option of CSOs by the government, or even force some organizations to close down operations. So also, as the expansion of CTM would threaten CSOs' sustainability and polarize them because of the weakening of their internal cohesion, and this will also make collective resistance to counterterrorism policies to be difficult because of CSOs have been polarized, and the government is co-opting some organizations, and repressing. That's what they call dual-pronged strategy of co-option and repression. That strategy is what government is using. They co-opt certain organizations and they repress those ones that they termed as what they have been termed as organizations that are, that engage in various forms of advocacy and activism. So they engage those organizations that are ready to serve government interests. So this is leading to the polarization of CSOs. And this has implication that the prospect of CSOs in resisting illiberal policies of civilian governments will continue to decline or evaporate. I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really wonderful talk. I'm going to hand over now to Saskia to open some questions.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Emeka, for this presentation and for your research. And also thank you to the organizers for inviting me and for hosting this event here today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start by congratulating Emeka for kind of, introducing a bit of empirical detail and empirical richness into this debate on the effects of counterterrorism measures on civil society. It is a topic that I think has garnered quite a bit of international attention over the past several years, particularly as people have become more aware of the global crisis facing civil society organizations in many places. And yet I think we still lack that kind of detailed research on, what does this actually mean on the ground? How is it impacting organizations that are conducting various types of activities? How is it playing out in their work? And so I think having that kind of survey data on perceptions is really important and kind of really enriches, I think, the discussions that are happening at the international level as well. I thought I would structure my comments here as follows. First, I want to spend some time placing what we just heard maybe in a bit of a global context, building on what Emeka talked about. Then talk a little bit about the policy implications of some of this research before ending with some ideas for, I think, future research that could build on your presentation and on your paper as well. So in terms of the global context, some of you may be aware that civil society organizations really over the past 2 decades have been experiencing increasing restrictions on their work. So these are taking, in many places the form of legal restriction, but we're also seeing an increase in extra legal measures. And according to the international organization Civic, 87% of the world's population actually now lives in a country where civic space is closed in some fashion, right? Closed, repressed, or obstructed are the categories that they use. So only a very small percentage of the global population actually lives in countries in which civic space is not limited or restricted in some way. And I think Nigeria and Sub-Saharan Africa in general has mostly followed these global trends. I just checked the latest data recently, and it looks like now, according to Civicus, 41 out of the 49 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa are categorized as having closed, repressed, or obstructed civic space. Originally those restrictions were more pronounced in East Africa, but over the past several years, as Emeka is alluding to, there's also been this negative trend in West Africa as well. And so we see this really stark contrast between the associational revolution that many countries experienced in the late 80s and the 90s, and then what is happening today around the world. And in my own research, I've been trying to kind of document the different drivers of this trend. A big part of the explanation is obviously the trend of global democratic backsliding and the fact that many governments, particularly semi-authoritarian governments, have become more worried about the threat of domestic civic uprisings and protests and domestic dissent. There's also been an increasing nationalist backlash against foreign aid for civil society, and this authoritarian development model has become more popular in certain countries and parts of the world. But as Emeka has outlined today, I think we really can't understand what's happening with civil society around the world without paying attention to the global counterterrorism industry that has emerged post 9/11. It's a really central driver of what's been happening in many countries. And I think what's interesting is that many people are aware of, right, the US-led war on terror and what the major manifestations of that. I think what people often miss is kind of the parallel evolution and emergence of this global infrastructure around counterterrorism that consists of different types of international multilateral organizations, many of which are not very well known, but that exert a huge amount of influence on state domestic policies. And the Financial Action Task Force that Emeka alluded to earlier, I think is a good example of that, right? Most people have not heard of this body before, but it is actually hugely influential. And I want to come back to that later. So what has that meant in practice? Well, because of this kind of emergence of this counterterrorism infrastructure, we've seen that between 2001 and 2018, actually 140 countries have adopted new counterterrorism legislation. So it's a really kind of striking trend and how much more legislation we've seen over the past couple of decades. Now, one could say, okay, that's not per se bad, right? There's increasing awareness of the risk of terrorism. There's a need for legal frameworks to respond to it. But as we've heard, this trend, I want to highlight kind of 3 main trends that we've seen. The first is that the UN Security Council and other international bodies have failed to explicitly define what is meant by terrorism or violent extremism, even as it has required states to pass legislation on these phenomena. So in a simple sense, states are passing laws without a clear global definition of what they are actually fighting. And so one of the most direct consequences of this trend has been the adoption of laws that have very vague and broad definitions of extremism and of terrorism. And that obviously, as you may guess, opens the door to abuses, right? Particularly in countries that already lack certain kinds of oversight mechanisms. And I think Emeka just alluded to some of the most egregious example out there. Egypt is a good example, right, of where anti-terrorist laws have really been abused by government authorities, not only to go after terrorists, however defined, but actually to go after critics, journalists, human rights defenders, put human rights defenders on terrorist watch lists, etc. So I think that is one really problematic trend. And also perhaps worth emphasizing that Western democracies are not immune from this. So this is not just a problem affecting kind of backsliding countries or authoritarian states. We've seen the same trends in some European democracies. I think France is a good example where new anti-terrorism laws have raised a lot of human rights concerns. Then the second trend, and this really speaks directly to Emeka's research, right, is this de facto, this more subtle kind of consequence of anti-terrorism laws, namely the use of terrorist financing rules to extend state control and oversight over civil society organizations. And that is really the consequence of international bodies drawing this direct linkage between anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing, and the threat kind of that civil society organizations pose in this area. So the need to regulate civil society organizations has become sort of a major international topic of concern. And then third, I think a third trend that we're seeing is this increasing use of narratives of national security threats, support for terrorist activity, to really attack and undermine the legitimacy of civil society advocacy and criticism. Because often what we see emerge in different countries is this rhetoric of you're either with us or you're with the terrorists, right? There's no room to actually legitimately criticize counterterrorism policies, like in the case of Nigeria, that have raised really legitimate and problematic human rights concerns, but there's no space to voice these demands because you get dismissed as being a supporter of terrorism if you express criticism of the government's security tactics. And then what we're seeing now is how these narratives of threats and of insecurity are then used to justify further and further legal measures, right? Increasingly new surveillance laws, for example, and now most recently over the course of the pandemic, we've seen that same narrative being extended to public health, right? Using kind of the public health crisis to pass new restrictive legislation and emergency measures. So in some, I just want to kind of highlight two, I think, crucial elements of this phenomena I think are really important to understand, both in the case of Nigeria and then at a global level. One is that I think even as we're seeing increasing international concern about democratic backsliding and the democratic crisis in many parts of the world, at the same time, we see that restrictions on civic space have in fact been enabled and sometimes encouraged by the international community and by the very same actors that in other spaces are kind of pushing for human rights norms, et cetera. So we see this kind of bifurcation of international policies. On the one hand, there's this concern about democracy. On the other hand, there's a counterterrorism infrastructure that actually pushes states to implement some of these restrictive measures. And I think the case of Nigeria exemplifies, right, with how international measures like the Financial Action Task Force guidelines have been directly domesticated in kind of domestic guidelines and laws. And then I think the second really important point is that so far we've seen no evidence that these legal restrictions on civil society actually reduce the terrorist threat or reduce the number of terrorist attacks. In fact, quite the opposite is the case. I think we have increasing research showing that these measures are ineffective, that civil society organizations can actually play a really useful role in fighting terrorism, particularly if they're able to address some of the root drivers of insecurity and extremism. And also we know increasingly from research, right, that human rights violations committed by state security forces in their fight against terrorism are often a driver of violent extremism and radicalization. So there's a mismatch between, I think, the empirical research and what some of these policies are driving states to do. Now, I think to me, this raises kind of the question, if these measures are ineffective, why has it been so difficult to push back against them at the international level? Why haven't there been more efforts at reform, even as there's growing awareness of some of these problems? And I would suggest kind of two, I think, key reasons why that's been the case. And perhaps in the discussion, we can talk a little bit more about how that's playing out in Nigeria as well. But I think the first one is that the global counterterrorism system is kind of uniquely complex and opaque and really difficult to understand, right? There's the UN system, which, you know, most people are roughly familiar with, but next to that is this whole kind of network of additional organizations, some of which are quite informal coalitions between states with selective memberships that actually make very influential soft law on issues of counterterrorism and countering terrorist financing. And that's sort of the complexity of the ecosystem in some ways is part of the problem. And then the second reason is that the system is not only complex, but it is really built to exclude civil society voices. It's a very state-centric system. It's not particularly transparent, and it usually excludes outside expertise and civil society voices. And so as a result, it's been really difficult for those most affected by counterterrorism measures to have a voice in these global discussions. And it basically creates a safe space for governments to kind of make these laws and these policies without being held accountable by those who are affected by them. Now, the good news is that there have been some changes. There is a group of international organizations and philanthropic funders that have been involved in trying to influence some of these discussions, including ongoing discussions actually about a new global counterterrorism strategy that are happening right now as we speak. And there have been some limited successes in also, for example, in changing how the Financial Action Task Force talks about civil society. So there's been some incremental progress. But there's still, I think, a lot more to do. And part of the problem is that there's not a lot of funding to do this work. There's limited awareness. Emeka's research shows that even a lot of local civil society organizations aren't really plugged into pushing back against governments or taking the government to task for some of these rules. And then part of the problem is that human rights groups, right, are usually used to engaging with the global human rights infrastructure, with aid agencies, with the UN Human Rights Council. They're sort of established channels for having these kind of discussions, even with foreign ministries. But they're often much less used to engaging with security agencies, with ministries of finance, with banks, with the kind of bodies that are really at the core of some of this problem. It's a different set of actors, and often there's not as much access and familiarity with those actors. I want to end with maybe reflecting on some kind of areas, I think, for future inquiry that kind of arose for me from the paper Emeka wrote and from your presentation, as well as more broadly. First, as I noted at the beginning, I think it's so important to actually gather more data on how these restrictions are impacting different kinds of organizations. And one of the things I appreciated the most about your analysis was the fact that you differentiate, right, between human rights groups, between faith groups, between women's groups, and kind of look at how these things are playing out differently for different types of organizations. And as you see emerge from the findings, it is actually different, right? Not all groups are affected, not all groups are targeted in the same way. And I think that's also what we've seen in other places, that those groups that engage on human rights issues most directly, or on sensitive issues like sexual violence, et cetera, they are the ones who run into most problems. So I think understanding these differences is really essential. And then I think feeding some of these experiences back to the international level. Now, one of the things that I found interesting, in your paper that in some ways it's surprising that there hasn't been more impact felt locally, right? But on the other hand, you know that you look at specifically those financial restrictions. So I think one question would be, are there other types of restrictions that particularly human rights actors are facing, or women's rights groups are facing, that are not maybe specifically financial in nature, but they have to do with kind of how the government talks about civil society groups, security threats, extra-legal threats, et cetera. And I think it would also be really interesting to go deeper kind of in the qualitative aspects of your research and think about, well, the organizations that actually have been affected, right, that note some of these, having experienced some of these issues. Can we find a correlation between kind of what issues they are focusing on and what triggers these restrictive responses, right? Is there a specific set of issues that the government is most sensitive to and responds to? And I also think we need to understand how these measures are actually impacting citizen perceptions of NGOs, right? If the government is painting human rights organizations as being supportive of Boko Haram, et cetera, is that actually resonating with the public? Do they believe these accusations, or is it actually, kind of dismissed and kind of do these actors still actually have quite a lot of legitimacy? And then I think a second question that emerges to me from the research is this question of pushback on the side of civil society and coalition building within civil society. Because we've seen in many other cases, like in Kenya, where there actually has been successful pushback against certain restrictions, that coalition building between civil society groups was really important, that there was a broad coalition that was built between different types of civic actors that were kind of recognized their common interests. But these coalitions haven't emerged in all places, and in some places it's been quite difficult. So actually understanding kind of the enabling condition that allow these coalitions to form, to push back against restrictions, I think is a really important policy question and also an interesting research question. You note that in Nigeria, there hasn't been that many organizations haven't actually kind of engaged in direct resistance against the government or haven't directly tried to shape government policies. Why is that the case, right? Is it mostly a lack of capacity on their side, a lack of information, or is there some sort of fear involved as well of getting involved in these discussions that they don't quite sure how the government will respond? So it'd be interesting to kind of understand a little bit more how these civil society groups see their role vis-a-vis the government. And then another question that emerged for me, and I think you touched on this at the beginning with the NSARS protests in Nigeria, is that our conversation about civil society is often very much focused on formal civil society organizations, right? Organizations that are NGOs, that are registered as such, that receive foreign funding, that have bank accounts, etc. But in many countries, we're actually seeing a shift from this kind of formal activism and formal civil society organizations to more informal types of mobilization and activism, especially in the form of mass protests. And Nigeria is a good example of that, where the mass protests, garnered so much international attention. And I think, to me, this is a really interesting area to watch, because in some ways, those kind of anti-financing laws and those legal restrictions don't really work against informal activists in the same way. In a number of countries, we've seen governments respond instead with much more aggressive anti-protest laws, where they're trying to push back against the mass mobilization on the streets and violent policing, et cetera. So I think this would be an interesting area to watch in Nigeria as well. Do we see perhaps a new kind of type of threat emerge that is more responsive to informal activism or mobilization? Or maybe not, right? Maybe the government is actually responsive to those citizen asks and actually initiate some reform. So understanding kind of the relationship between the rise of more informal activism and then these legal measures that are being advanced by governments, I think is another interesting area for further investigation. And then I would just end, because we're speaking in 2021 and we've just been or are still in the middle of this global pandemic. Over the past 20 years, this issue of national security and counterterrorism has become such a big human rights issue. And I think over the past year, we've seen this rising concern among some human rights activists that the pandemic is kind of feeding into this trend. Because as I alluded to earlier, right, there's this risk that public health becomes sort of the new national security. It's kind of a justification for more restrictions. And what we know with the kind of emergency restrictions is that they often become permanent, right? Because there's always a new crisis that can justify their continuation. So I think this is just, globally a really important area to watch what happens as we move out of the pandemic and move out of the sort of emergency situation that we've been in. How many of these restrictions that have been implemented over the past year actually get repealed, and how many become permanent and feed into this closing of civic space that has been happening for the past 15 years or so. So I want to end here, and I'm happy, obviously, to answer any questions or take comments as well. And thank you all again.
Thank you, both of you, for this wonderful event. If anyone has a question, then please do raise your hands virtually or on camera, or write something in the chat to indicate that you'd like to talk, and then we can come to you in turn. Does anyone have a question that they'd like to ask? I can start with a very general one. I mean, Emeka, you talked about, attacks on human rights activists in the name of safety. Based on your findings of how CSOs have responded to these kinds of rhetorical policy strategies in Nigerian security specifically, could you maybe talk a little bit more also about what you see as the most effective counter strategies for tackling these kinds of policies more widely in other national contexts too, because obviously we're interested in large scale political developments, I suppose, here at ECPS.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Saskia, for that elaborate and detailed conversations on the various manifestations of counterterrorism policies across the world. Yeah, now if I get it correctly, you wanted to understand what, talk about the most effective countermeasures that CSOs are taking in repressing CSOs. Well, from my research, which the fieldwork was actually done in 2015 and interviews, and of course, the research ended in 2018. I have not seen, from my conversations with civil society organizations, there have not been, efforts by these organizations to really, tackle or counter or push back on government counterterrorism policies. But the question then is what efforts, what ways can CSOs get government? I think CSOs can be effective if they are able to inform the public, inform the generality of the Nigerian public on the various effects of these countries, because most Nigerians, just particularly in response to what Saskia said about what have been the perceptions of generality of Nigerians on counterterrorism policies, a lot of Nigerians are not so much aware about these laws or the effect of these laws, except when it happened in 2020, where counterterrorism laws were invoked by the government to close the accounts of 20 protesters. And the youths were like, I'm not a terrorist. How is it possible that I have been, my account is closed on the guise of terrorism? I've never had anything to do with terrorists. And so ways that civil societies can be effective is to, inform the public on the dangers of these laws and to get a more coordinated or a more elaborated, a more broad resistance, of not just civil society organizations, but civil society to mean the citizens of the country, getting to understand these laws and push back, talk to their legislators, or talk to various governments at various levels to repeal or to amend some of the provisions of these laws. I think that's the only way, that's one of the ways that they can be effective, because perhaps during the military rule, we had a very active civil society organizations. They resisted the military. They were successful in doing so, and it was as a result of more of a coordinated approach where they have not just both faith-based organizations and various kinds of groups coming together to, engage the government, to get the government or to get the military out of government. And so this is the same way that CSOs can be able to push back effectively and get the government to amend various provisions of these laws that target their operations. So they need a large number of citizens to be informed about the dangers of these laws and to resist the government, to pressure government to rethink and amend these laws. And this has been effective in the NGO regulatory bill. CSOs know the contents of these laws, and they know that if this bill becomes a law, it's going to close down every means of their access to funds. And so what they did was to just get a large number of civils, like coordinating themselves to resist these laws. They go on social media, they go on the TV to educate the masses on the dangers of such laws. So that, I believe, is one of the effective ways that they can go about pushing back or getting the government to amend many of the provisions of the counterterrorism laws in Nigeria, both the TPA, that's the Terrorism Prevention Act, and the Money Laundering Prohibition Act of 2011 as amended.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question in the chat from Erkan. Would you like me to read it out, or would you like to read it out?
Yes, please go ahead. No problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
The question here is that even if there is no resistance, how do security policies impact the ideological discourses and narratives of civil society organizations? Is there a change about their narratives after having pressure or constraints coming from governmental authorities? And if such change does exist, isn't it a form of resistance?
Okay, I want to read the question one after the other. I'm trying to see. Okay, could you say any information in that?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in on the first question. If I understand it correctly, asking about how are civil society organizations adapting their own narratives and strategies in response to government pressure. I mean, one thing I have seen in my own research, particularly going back further in Egypt and in Ethiopia, was that organizations did sometimes very much shift their activities once there was pressure from governments. Not all, right? So there is often what you see is kind of different strategies adapted by different actors. Some actors chose to stay in the country, chose to continue the advocacy work and face potential consequences for that. Others chose to leave the country and try to, once repression increased, and try to continue the advocacy from abroad as much as they could. And then other actors, what you sometimes see is a shift to more service delivery work and away from advocacy work, because there is, particularly if there are increasing restrictions on advocacy work, on receiving funding for advocacy work, you sometimes see organizations try and shift a little bit more to non-political service delivery work to maintain some space for operating. Not sure if that 100% answers your questions, but those are some of the patterns that I've observed.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I also want to respond to some of the questions. I do not have data on the sources of funding for CSOs. That's a very difficult data to assess. Most CSOs would not disclose the sources of funding to you, so I don't have that information. And for the second question, which finances themselves, okay, the CSO, okay, the second question, and what is the ratio of government organized non-governmental organizations in Nigeria among CSOs? Well, there are organizations that have been classified as governmental, non-governmental organizations in the sense that they are more like government agents, because they are ready to serve the interest of government as regards the interest of the masses. So yeah, I do not have the figure about which of the organizations. No CSOs will come to tell you that they are government agents, but with their actions or the type of policies or the way they go with government policies, they don't criticize, even though these policies are repressive or these policies are, are targeting various citizens. They are just more silent about many of these policies. Now, some of these organizations were established by either governments, by those who have served in the government, they've left the government, they are established organizations, and government uses these organizations as a front, for, carrying out various forms of activities that puts them in a better light before the public and before the international community. But which of these organizations are government-oriented organizations? We can see that in terms of their actions, in terms of how they respond to government policies, whether it is repressive or not. And we can see that in terms of how they are easily, engaged by government in carrying out various service delivery activities and not engaged in any form of advocacy. They just go with the government because they are more like government controlling whatever they are doing. So I don't have specific figure to say these are the government organized organizations and these are the authentic organizations, but we could see that from their various actions in terms of within the polity in Nigeria. So yeah. I believe I've tried to answer that question.
Thank you for that. Does anyone else have any questions? If you do, then write something in the chat, and it'd be good to keep this conversation going a little longer.
I might perhaps share some reflections of my own. So as someone who is totally foreign to the field of terrorism, counterterrorism, I had some thoughts as I was reading your article, Emeka, that you kind of envisioned this future in which counterterrorism strategies will be stricter, and it's going to be more and more difficult for especially smaller scale NGOs to be able to sustain themselves without financial aid from foreign donors, without the support with international development, support from international development projects. So I was thinking, I've been reading recently more and more scholars discussing about the negative implications and the impact of the international development projects for the so-called global south. So I was thinking whether or to what extent it's possible to envision a scenario in which those civil society organizations are going to develop strategies to sustain themselves without this aid. I'm assuming that they are largely dependent on this to be able to survive. is this too unrealistic to imagine, or might it inadvertently, create an environment where they are going to be able to, achieve more independence, or perhaps, I'm just trying to imagine the current landscape, but I can understand that in an authoritarian regime, it's perhaps very difficult, but then also this creative resistance strategy is also developed within these kind of circumstances, perhaps. I don't know, just want to hear your reflections on this.
Yeah, thank you for that question. In Africa, generally, most CSOs and even government depend on foreign aid to survive, foreign aid to carry out their activities. They don't have this established culture of philanthropy where rich individuals give out to CSOs, particularly in Nigeria, and of course, also in some African countries. We don't have those form of culture where individuals within the state, donate money to civil society organizations. So most organizations depend on foreign aid in order to operate. And of course, government do not really fund or provide any form of support to CSOs, except those ones in which they want to, because once government gives out money or gives out any form of support to CSOs, or even invite CSOs at meetings and whatever, is to get them to sanctions or approve whatever policies that have been established or implemented. CSOs are more like giving a form of legitimacy to government actions. And so, to answer your questions, many of these organizations depend on various foreign aids from countries, international development agencies, and they can hardly survive with this. And what the counterterrorism financing law have done is to put some form of restriction, in a sense that the government would, government established mechanisms to, regulate their access to this foreign aid, because they direct most of these organizations to register with the the National Financial Intelligence Unit. And in the registration process, they are required to provide various documents, various audit reports. And many of these smaller organizations or community-based organizations do not have the capacity to hire accountants or financial experts to be able to do all these audits. And so with that, they are not registered with the EFCC or the Nigerian Financial Intelligence Unit. And so they cannot access this fund. And many of them are closing down. And what they do, another approach, is to merge with bigger organizations that are able to meet up with these regulations. And so many of these community-based organizations that have grassroots they have grassroots connections with communities, understand their problems, understand those issues are disappearing because of the counterterrorism law. So yes, I doubt if many of these organizations can survive without foreign aid. So yeah, stop there.
Perhaps to add to what Emeka just said, in some countries, for example, Russia, I think is a good example of that, where some of these restrictions were implemented really early on, like now more than 10 years ago. In some cases, we actually saw that, some organizations tried to switch to more domestic funding sources because of the dynamic you alluded to, right? It was in some ways a wake-up call to say, okay, we need to raise more domestic funding. They tried crowdfunding and other mechanisms. In some ways, that's maybe positive, right? They tried to build more of a domestic constituency. Now, recognizing that Russia is a middle-income country and there's a bigger, maybe urban constituency that can support that kind of work. But still, even in that context, it was really difficult. It was really difficult to raise the funding. And also, the government came after domestic funding as well. So they started implementing restrictions on crowdsourcing and other domestic funding sources as foreign agents, even after they had stopped receiving foreign funding. So I think in contexts where government is really set, on restricting civil society organizations, stopping to, just switching to domestic funding sources, if that's possible. And as Emeka said, it's really difficult in some contexts, but it might not even prevent some of these restrictive measures. So I think it's a really challenging situation as a result. And I think at the international level, there's been kind of two impulses. One is, we have to advocate for the right to receive foreign funding because it is a human right, or it's part of the right to association. So we need to continue to stand up for that right. At the same time as maybe we can try and build more of a domestic philanthropy structure in many countries that would kind of provide a richer source of domestic funding sources to get at some of these issues of dependency that you're raising. But I don't think it's a short-term solution.
Yes, thanks a lot for these reflections. And perhaps one final question. Is anyone in the chat? Does anyone have a question? No, then I will ask the final question perhaps. So I was wondering also, Saskia, because also I think this is your research in your PhD, and Emeka also briefly mentions in his article about how women organizations are more specifically being targeted because they want to advocate for the rights of women and girls. Can you perhaps a little bit elaborate on this, Emeka, and perhaps the nature of like what role does gender play in the resistance, in the pushback against such counterterrorism strategies and restrictions? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I remember when I went to the field to, when I went for my field work in 2015, I had finished interviewing a female NGO executive that focused on the rights of women and girls in the Northeast. And she asked me, why didn't you ask about sexual violence? That's an issue that we are facing as women operating in the Northeast. And I was like, it's not in the literature. I didn't even think about it. It's like, and so, yeah, that got me thinking. So when I went for another interview, the person happens to be a woman too that I just returned from the Northeast. And I asked her, were there concerns of sexual violence? Oh, yes, that she was, told that she'd be careful in the Northeast that she could get raped. And nobody would hear about it because this information, people don't talk about it because of cultural issues. Because if a woman declares that she's raped, she's in some way ostracized. And so, yeah, there have been reports of sexual violence by counterterrorism security agents, even by aid workers, local aid workers, and various community people within the Northeast, and even the civilian joint task force, these vigilante groups. These categories of counterterrorism officials and aid workers have been engaged in various forms of human rights abuse, and particularly sexual violence. And the government have been largely silent about this issue. And that is affecting particularly female NGOs from operating. Many of them have to choose certain areas to operate, areas that are convenient and safe for them to operate, and exclude certain areas, even though those areas are in need of aids or development projects. They had to focus on those areas that they are comfortable and safe to operate, because they don't trust the security agents. They don't trust the security agents to work with the security agents to go to those places, because they might, they don't know what might happen. And many of them say that they usually get afraid when they see a security agent and they are alone. So they are usually afraid because anything can happen and nobody gets to know about it. So yes, so that's the gender part of it. And it has implications for counterterrorism policies, because violation of human rights, particularly sexual violence, create grievances by local communities. And these local communities provide intelligence to governments. And once that happens, they don't inform government about the movement of terrorist group, and they are more pro-terrorist groups than government. And that has adverse implications in terms of government enforcing or targeting or repressing a terrorist group. It also has implications for aid workers, female aid workers who are involved in counterterrorism, mitigating the effects of terrorism, and they have had to restrict their operations, because of fears of, getting sexually violated. So that's an issue that had emerged in the conversation that I had. And of course, I have gone ahead to write a paper that I termed the vicarious traumatization. It was titled "The Ligaments of Counterterrorism." Like they said, how counterterrorism policies manifest. There are various manifestations of counterterrorism policies, and sexual violence is one aspect in terms of how security agents or counterterrorism security agents violate human rights or violate the rights of women in carrying out their operations. And so that has also affected CSOs, because number one, they are afraid to operate. Number two, even psychologically, when they interview or try to help those victims of sexual violence in the Northeast, they themselves are traumatized in this process. That's what they call indirect trauma. And so that affects them. That affects their activities, their efforts in mitigating terrorism. So yes, these are all the dynamics, the various manifestations of counterterrorism and how it has impacted women, NGOs in the Northeast. I believe I've answered that question. I know I'm kind of, touching on various areas. So.
Thank you. Also, Saskia, perhaps you might want to share some reflections from your research.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, yeah, I agree with what Emeka shared in the sense that I think the security threats for female civic activists are often different and distinct and often worse in some ways because they face kind of, you know, the threats that male human rights defenders face as well, in addition to more gendered threats and risks in some contexts. So I think it's really important to pay attention to those gendered implications. And then on the broader question you asked about, you know, the role of women in counterterrorism, I mean, it's a huge topic area and a lot of researchers who've worked on this, but I think two points maybe to make, namely that, you know, unfortunately, traditionally in those discussions, often women have been framed as victims, right? They're the victims of terrorist groups, et cetera. Whereas I think in recent years, we've shifted to a bit of a more nuanced discussion that recognizes that women can join violent extremist groups. And I think, you know, there's been great research done on Boko Haram, you know, and other groups trying to understand why women join these groups and what are their motivations. And then also what are the specific needs for kind of moving, you know, those women out of these groups and de-radicalization, et cetera, that, you know, you can't just design those policies with a gender blind lens, but have to understand kind of the specific motivations and also specific experiences of women inside and outside of these groups to really design policies that are effective. And then on the other side as well, that, you know, women are really crucial actors at the local level, often when it comes to peace building and trying to counteract violent extremism and identifying violent extremism and like risks of violent extremism. So I think there's also really, you know, an important kind of lens there, and when we're actually trying to design counterterrorism policies, understanding what these activities are that women of rights groups are already engaged in and how they're talking about these issues, while trying to you know, not kind of essentialize women either and say, you know, women are the peace builders or they're the ones who can prevent violent extremism and sort of we have to include them in this agenda as a result, but actually listen to their agenda and what they want to do and what their priorities are. So I think there's been progress in kind of having a more nuanced take on this, but I think there's a lot more work to be done for that to actually filter up and down into the actual counterterrorism policies.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for today, but it was a pleasure to see everyone here today. Thank you so much to both Emeka and Saskia for being so generous with their time. And thank you also to everyone who's asked questions. It's been a small and intimate conversation here tonight, but as we know, many people catch up with these events later on YouTube. So these important ideas will end up reaching quite a large audience. It's time now for a break for the summer after a busy few months for ECPS, but more events are coming soon. Don't panic, and we'll keep you updated about those as and when we've got them confirmed. In the meantime, you can catch up on past events on the YouTube page and directly from the ECPS website. Until then, though, thank you so much for attending tonight, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.